So in the last class, we saw that Stephen more or less realized that he won't accept the offer of priesthood. But that realization is not summarily expressed, but through a long process of thought that gradually comes into full expression. And the rest of this chapter 4 refers to his thinking about his university days. So as I was saying, that in the rest of the chapter we see Stephen thinking more about his overcoming the immaturity of his school days, and he reflects about his university days, and also engages in important conversations with his friends. So I am skipping a few pages, and then I come to the paragraph where he is looking at Christian Brothers, some members of Christian Brothers, which was a kind of Jesuit organization, and by looking at them, he is aesthetically repelled by the ugliness, the overall ugliness, we may say, of these brothers. So he turned seaward from the road at Dollymount, and as he passed onto the thin wooden bridge, he felt the planks shaking with the tramp of heavily shod feet. A squad of Christian Brothers was on its way back from the bull and had begun to pass 2 by 2 across the bridge. Soon the whole bridge was trembling and resounding. The uncouth faces passed him 2 by 2, stained yellow or red or livid by the sea, and as he strove to look at them with ease and indifference, a faint stain of personal shame and commiseration rose to his own face. So, why does he feel shame looking at them? First of all, they are walking 2 by 2 in a kind of regimented, disciplined manner, and Stephen hates this kind of discipline in the church or in the Jesuit organization. And as they speak to one another or call out one another's names, Stephen feels that they not only look ugly, but they have also ugly names. Angry with himself, he tried to hide his face from their eyes by gazing down sideways into the shallow, swirling water under the bridge, but he still saw a reflection therein of their top-heavy silk hats and humble tape-like collars and loosely hanging clerical clothes. So nothing is aesthetically pleasing. Their clothes, their names, their faces, Brother Hickey, Brother Quaid, Brother McAdoo, Brother Piao. Their piety would be like their names, like their faces, like their clothes. And it was idle for him to tell himself that their humble and contrite hearts, it might be, paid a far richer tribute of devotion than his had ever been. A gift tenfold more acceptable than his elaborate adoration. So, whereas it is quite possible that these Christian brothers were more devout than Stephen, but Stephen still won't, appreciate them for their, repentance, their triteness, or their humility, because they stand for him the regimentation in the Roman Catholic system. So this piety, which should be considered a virtue, Stephen feels that it is as ugly as their clothes or names or faces. So we see that in Roman Catholicism there are some aspects which attract Stephen. For example, the image of Virgin Mary, or the sculptures, the statues, the paintings, whatever can be seen in Roman Catholic churches. So the aesthetic aspect one aspect of this religion has aesthetic appeal, and the other aspect, that is the piety, the humility, and the lack of aesthetic appeal that we find in their regimentation, discipline, and so on. So that repels him. So as I told you earlier, that he has a love and hate relationship with Roman Catholicism. Then he thinks of a phrase, a day of dappled sea-born clouds. He drew forth a phrase from his treasure and spoke it softly to himself. So we see that now Stephen is also talking about or thinking about prose. So we have seen a number of instances Stephen thinking about poetry or composing poetry, but Cardinal Newman, who was a great writer of prose, has a great influence on Stephen. The phrase and the day and the scene harmonized in a chord. Words, was it their colors? He allowed them to glow and fade, hue after hue. Sunrise gold, the russet and green of apple orchards, azure of waves, the grey-fringed fleece of clouds. So one sees color in nature, but Stephen sees color in words. So this may be called a kind of synesthesia, where even language represents some kind of color, which we, for example, find in the symbolic poet Arthur Rimbaud, the French poet, who has a poem called Vowels, where Rimbaud assigns each vowel a particular color. So this is possible by the extremely heightened sensibility of the poet or the artist. No, it was not their colors, it was the poise and balance of the period itself. Did he then love the rhythmic rise and fall of words better than their associations of legend and color? Or was it that being as weak of sight as he was shy of mind, he drew less pleasure from the reflections of the glowing sensible world through the prism of the language, many colored and richly storied, than from the contemplation of an inner world of individual emotions, mirrored perfectly in a lucid, supple, periodic prose? So he is debating in his own mind whether he likes the colors of things or he finds a greater pleasure in language. And in the prosodic pattern or the rhythm, the intonation and so on. And we notice that here Joyce uses the word period, which was much used in Roman rhetoric. In Ciceronian prose, we find period, or even in Seneca. So Roman prose writers, they observed meter or prosody even in prose, not only in poetry. And therefore, periods were very important because of their rhythm, their prosody. Then we find another scene of bullying. So even though Stephen is not a child anymore, he is kind of adolescent and grown up as a university student, but still he is very young, and the other boys still bully him. So they are near the sea, and they are trying to bully one another, and they call him in the Greek form of his name, Hello Stephanos. Here comes the Daedalus. And then they try to drown him in the water, duck him. Come along, Daedalus, bous Stephanoumenos, bous Stephanophoros. So they are using Greek phrases. Bous Stephanoumenos means the sacrificial bull. Bous Stephanophoros means the sacrificial bull which is garlanded. So these were customs of ancient Greece to garland a bull and to sacrifice them. Okay. So it's something not very different from us, from Indians. We garland them, but we do not sacrifice them. Okay. So they are mocking Stephen's name, which has a Greek element in it, Daedalus, and they try to drown him in the water. Stephen does not feel much disturbed by their bantering. Their banter was not new to him, and now it flattered his mild, proud sovereignty. Now as never before, the strange name seemed to him a prophecy. So timeless seemed the grey, warm air, so fluid and impersonal his own mood, that all ages were as one to him. A moment before, the ghost of the ancient kingdom of the Danes had looked forth through the vesture of the haze-wrapped city. Now at the name of the fabulous artificer, he seemed to hear the noise of dim waves and to see a winged form flying above the waves and slowly climbing the air. What did it mean? Was it a quaint device opening a page of some medieval book of prophecies and symbols, a hawk-like man flying sunward above the sea, a prophecy of the end he had been born to serve and had been following through the mists of childhood and boyhood, a symbol of the artist forging anew in his workshop out of the sluggish matter of the earth, a new soaring, impalpable, imperishable being. The purpose of this paragraph and the rest of the chapter is to make the reader conscious of the development in Stephen's psyche and how more and more he decides to become an artist. So when the boys jokingly call him by his name Daedalus, he thinks of the ancient artificer, that is Daedalus, the Daedalus myth, who invented wings and flew with his wings. Now we all know the myth of Daedalus and his son Icarus, who flew too near the sun and fell into the sea. This has been a theme of many paintings also, or poems. So for Stephen, this appears to be a prophecy. So by remembering the Daedalus myth, he thinks of the prophecy of Daedalus, the great artist who faced several challenges in his life and find a way out of this life, a way of escape through his art. Then he thinks of the ancient kingdoms which earlier came and conquered Ireland, the Danes, for example, and he thinks of his own childhood and boyhood as misty, past. So his consciousness flows through this passage of time, which is not actual time, but time in his consciousness. So this is something, a remarkable, discovery made by Bergson. Time could be historical, time could be subjective. So the subjective time in somebody's consciousness, it can easily move back and forth, and unlike historical time, which moves in only one direction. So he is trying to understand the myth of Daedalus, the meaning or the significance of that myth for him. And this phrase, hawk-like man, is once again used in Ulysses, Joyce's novel. So these, repetitions of words and phrases from earlier novels in later novels is a means of presenting a continuity of thought. So continuity of thought from earlier work to later work and so on. Then as they drown him, 1, 2, look out, oh Christ, I'm drowned, 1, 2, 3, and away, me next, and so on. So they repeatedly call him Stephanophoros, thus alluding to the Greek, culture or the Greek myth. What is Stephen's reaction to this? As he is being bullied by his friends, he is not thinking about this bullying at all. It does not affect him at all. So in his mind, he is living a different life. His soul had arisen from the grave of boyhood, spurning her grave clothes. Yes, he would create proudly out of the freedom and power of his soul, as the great artificer whose name he bore, a living thing, new and soaring and beautiful, impalpable, imperishable. Now this reflection and also this chapter will end with the image of the bird girl or bird-like girl which Stephen sees on the shore. And we'll see that the bird-like girl rouses in Stephen conflicting drives, conflicting interests. He is looking at the bird girl as a muse, as one of these, an image that inspires him, but also looks at her sexually. And this ambiguity of creation may mean both creation of an artistic work, but it may also mean procreation, creation of a living thing. And we see that this is the language that Stephen uses here, that he is going to create a living thing, new and soaring and beautiful, impalpable, imperishable. Now, no living thing is imperishable. Is there a contradiction here? Actually not. Because in his psyche, Stephen is merging art with sexuality. So, a work of art is imperishable, impalpable. It does not die. So we may say that here Joyce is, fully exploiting Freud's idea of sublimation of the sexual drive by an artist. And again, we see Stephen reflecting about his boyhood. Where was his boyhood now? Where was the soul that had hung back from her destiny to brood alone upon the shame of her wounds and in her house of squalor and subterfuge, to queen it in faded cerements and in reeds that withered at the touch? So all these images of shame, squalor, and faded cerements, these images are derived from his childhood, which was beset with poverty. He lived his childhood and boyhood in poverty. So, as he tries to transcend his world or his experience through art, he also wants to transcend his poverty or the ugliness, the squalor that poverty engenders. And he feels that he is lonely. He thinks of his boyhood and he feels that his soul as a child or as a boy, where is that soul now? That is not to be found now, which means that he feels that he has grown beyond that childhood or boyhood. This is the idea that we keep changing in our lives. We do not remain the same. We regenerate. We become new. He was alone. He was unheeded, happy and near to the wild heart of life. He was alone and young and willful and wild-hearted, alone amid a waste of wild air and brackish waters, and the sea harvest of shells and tangle, and veiled grey sunlight, and gay-clad, light-clad figures of children and girls, and voices childish and girlish in the air. You see Joyce's art, how he is gradually drawing the reader to the theme of the girl. Even before the girl, arrives on the scene, he speaks of, childish, girlish figures and so on. So the focus here is on Stephen's loneliness, even though he is standing among people on the seashore, which is not at all completely isolated. There are people all around, but he feels that he is alone. This is the loneliness of an artist. An artist is alone not by virtue of physical isolation, but mental isolation or alienation from others. A girl stood before him in midstream, alone and still, gazing out to sea. So you see this art of parallelism. Stephen is alone, the girl is also alone. Now conventionally, one might think that using the same word repeatedly is a fault of style. But we see that Joyce makes it a feature of his style. Earlier we saw how many times he repeated the word dull or dullness. Here we see that he repeats the word alone. So the purpose is to create a parallelism, the psychic state in which Stephen is at that moment. It appears that the girl is also, in a way, like him, standing alone. She seemed like one whom magic had changed into the likeness of a strange and beautiful sea-bird. Her long, slender, bare legs were delicate as a crane's, and pure, save where an emerald trail of seaweed had fashioned itself as a sign upon the flesh. Her thighs, fuller and soft-hued as ivory, were bared almost to the hips, but the white fringes of her drawers were like featherings of soft white down. Her slate blue skirts were tilted boldly about her waist and dovetailed behind her. Her bosom was as a bird's, soft and light, slight and soft as the breast of some dark-plumaged dove. But her long fair hair was girlish and touched with the wonder of mortal beauty, her face. You also see inversion of the ordinary sentence structure, which adds a poetic quality to the paragraph. So the girl is described in a sensual way. Her bare legs, her skirt, tucked under her waist, exposing, part of her body, and her thighs fuller and soft-hued as ivory. We have earlier seen that Stephen imagined Emma's arms to be of ivory, and ivory is a word that is used in the chant of Virgin Mary, in praise of Virgin Mary. So the thighs were bared almost to the hips, and her drawers, the fringes of her drawers, they looked like plumes of a swan. So her elongated neck appeared like that of a crane, and perhaps her two long legs also made Stephen think of a crane. So in this, her bosoms are compared to that of a dove. So in this figure, in this image, we see that the girl image and the bird image, they are coalesced, they are mixed together. And we had throughout the novel a number of female images. If we remember, a Madeline, sorry, not Madeline, but Mercedes. Virgin Mary, the prostitute, different female figures, and all these female figures is different psyche. They tend to merge, and in Jungian terms, this may be called Stephen's anima. So his pursuit of his anima. Anima, we know in Latin means the soul, and Jung theorized that every person, male or female, looks for completion of her soul in another person of the opposite sex. So a boy looks for a girl which is his anima, or that soul that will fulfill him, that will provide him with with that he lacked. And a girl would look for her animus in boys. Now, many critics have interpreted this paragraph, but here are some images which need interpretation, and I will tell you about the interpretation by the critic named Norman Holland in an essay which is included in a book called A Critical History of a Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, edited by R.B. Karshner. It is a very good book. If you can get hold of this book, I would suggest that you read it. I don't know whether you can see it. Edited by Karshner, K-E-R-S-H-N-E-R. The name of the book is A Critical History of a Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I am writing the name of the editor here in the chat box. Now here the critic whose essay I am reading from is Norman N. Holland. So he is explaining the bird girl image, and particularly the images of a crane. What an extraordinary comparison. I can't help wondering if Joyce knew the various meanings people have given the crane. Knowing Joyce, I think it likely he did. Robert Graves noted that in India, the crane is associated with the mother goddess Kali, the destroyer. Okay, Robert Graves knows about this, I do not know. Maybe in some part of India, the goddess Kali is associated with the crane. The cranes also make letters as they fly in their V formation. Hence, in ancient Ireland, the crane was associated with literary secrets. Hence too, the crane is sacred to Delian Apollo, god of learning, and to Thoth, whose symbol was a crane-like white ibis. You know, Thoth is the Norse god. Thoth is a Norse god who invented writing. So, the crane is associated with Apollo, with Thoth, with the goddess Kali, and so on. So, the Thoth's symbol was a crane-like white ibis who invented writing and reformed the calendar. That is Thoth. Thoth and Apollo are, of course, two of Stephen's tutelary deities, literary ideals that substitute for the punitive god of the priests. So, the punitive god of Christianity, of Roman Catholicism, is substituted by Stephen apparently with the god Thoth and Apollo. So, one is from Roman mythology, another is from Norse mythology, and Apollo is associated with oracle and prophecies, and thought is associated with writing. Therefore, they would be appropriate gods for an artist. According to various classical legends, the alphabet was brought to Greece by Mercury, carried in a bag made of the skin of a crane. So this is also to be found in Robert Graves. The bag itself was protected with a gorgon head, which, if we follow Freud, symbolizes the female genitals. In a very literal way, the downy drawers of the crane girl contain both the creative secret of woman and the secret of writing. So you can see that the idea of creation, how it blends seamlessly with the idea of procreation. She is both the punishing mother, that is Dante or Stephen's aunt, and the desired woman who holds the secret of creativity. At least if I read her according to a goddess-obsessed Graves, the ivory in her coloring echoes Solomon's Song of Songs, thy neck is as a tower of ivory. Joyce mentions the passage before attributing it to the Virgin Mary, as is traditional in Roman Catholic readings of the Song of Songs. But here it is the woman's thighs that are ivory. The ivory tower is also the traditional retreat of poets, making Stephens, like Hamlet's, a fair thought to lie between maid's legs. Okay, so the least that we can say about this image is that it is a very powerful image where the bird symbol, which we remember is a symbol of flight or escape, repeated in this novel, and the girl symbol, which is the symbol of sexuality, desire, anima, and ultimate creativity. These two symbols merge here. She was alone and still, gazing out to sea, and when she felt his presence and the worship of his eyes, her eyes turned to him in quiet sufferance of his gaze. So Stephen is looking at her, and she feels his gaze, and her eyes turn to him in quiet sufferance of his gaze, and then quietly withdraw her eyes from his and bend them towards the stream, gently stirring the water with her foot hither and thither. The first faint noise of gently moving water broke the silence, low and faint and whispering, faint as the bells of sleep, hither and thither, and a faint flame trembled on her cheek. Heavenly God, cried Stephen's soul in an outburst of profane joy. So notice profane joy, because Joyce wants to assure his reader, or to make sure that his reader understands that what Stephen was feeling right now was not anything to do with religion, but it was profane, and deliberately so. As an artist, Stephen wanted to merge together the profane with the sacred. So as we can see here, so many images taken from religion, whether Christian or pagan, that these images are merged in Stephen's psyche with the image of the girl, which is a sensual image of the girl, even arousing him sexually. So this kind of merging of secular and religious, or religious and profane, you remember we also see in John Donne's poetry, in metaphysical poetry. So the purpose here is to establish that creativity or art is both like a religion as well as it is not a religion. So to artists, art is a religion, and in Stephen's life, art is definitely going to replace religion. He turned away from her suddenly and set off across the strand. His cheeks were aflame, that is, aflame with passion, with desire. His body was aglow, his limbs were trembling. On and on and on and on he strode, far out over the sands, singing wildly to the sea, trying to greet the advent of the life that had cried to him. Her image had passed into his soul forever, and no word had broken the holy silence of his ecstasy. Her eyes had called him, and his soul had leaped at the call. To live, to err, to fall, to triumph, his soul had leaped at the call. To live, to err, to fall, to triumph, to recreate life out of life. A wild angel had appeared to him, the angel of mortal youth and beauty, an envoy from the fair courts of life, to throw open before him in an instant of ecstasy the gates of all the ways of error and glory, on and on and on and on. He halted suddenly and heard his heart in the silence. How far had he walked? What hour was it? So in this paragraph we see repetition of words like ecstasy and mortal. So earlier he spoke of mortal beauty in the face of the girl, and here he speaks of mortal youth and beauty. And ecstasy, as I told you earlier, is considered to be a feeling akin to orgasm. So there is this great sculpture by Michelangelo of the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa in the Vatican, which I explained to you, is an expression of ecstasy when a beam of light falls upon her. Her expressions, her posture, everything suggests a kind of joy which is similar to orgasm. And a repetition also of the word error. And error is glorified. Now, as you may know that error is considered a human quality. Seneca wrote the phrase errare humanum est, which we translate as to err is human. And Milton makes use of this word error in an etymological sense in Paradise Lost. And he often uses the word erring. If you remember in book 2, perhaps, that he says that the people who believed that the pagan gods they fell recently, they were mistaken, because actually they were the fallen angels who fell much earlier when they were thrown out of heaven by Jesus' army. So Milton uses the word erring very often, and in book 1 he describes a river meandering through paradise in a zigzag way, which is where he uses the word erring again in the etymological sense of moving in a zigzag fashion, that is to err. So the straight path is always the honest path, and moving in a zigzag fashion is an erring way or different way. And Joyce, of course, knew much more about the history of the word erring in literature, and here he almost glorified erring. So error is represented here as a human glory, because men make mistakes, men are from the path suggested by religion or Christianity. Therefore, for a man, celibacy is not the path, even though it may be, dictated by religion. A man has to earn. And as an artist, Stephen feels the desire or the need for earning. And by earning, having sexual experience, and through sexual experience, attaining or achieving procreation. So in Stephen's psyche, as I told you already, creation and procreation, they are looked upon as similar. And if we analyze this with the help of Freudian discourse, then also Freud's theory that the artists, they sublimate their sexual drive through their writing, through their poetry, through their artistic creations, that we may say, find support, or maybe the underlying thought behind Joyce's imagining creation and procreation to be similar. There was no human figure near him, nor any sound borne to him over the air, but the tide was near the turn, and already the day was on the wane. He turned landward and ran toward the shore, and running up the sloping beach, reckless of the sharp shingle, found the sandy nook amid a ring of tufted sand knolls, and lay down there that the peace and silence of this evening might still the riot of his blood. The riot of his blood refers to the sexual passions aroused in him as a result of this encounter. And another psychoanalytic critic, explaining this Bardal image, referred to the description of the girl's leg, all ivory in color, but the leg is greenish, where it is covered by some moss, and that is explained by the psychoanalytic critic as the representation of a fetish for the girl's legs. That is, according to psychoanalysis, a fetish is desire for a part of the body, which earlier also we have seen Stephen was interested in the socks that a girl was wearing. Now comes the very significant climax of this chapter, as well as this psychical experience, where we have the image of the white rose taken from Dante's Divine Comedy. He closed his eyes in the language of sleep, in the languor of sleep. His eyelids trembled as if they felt the vast cyclic movement of the earth and her watchers, trembled as if they felt the strange light of some new world. His soul was swooning into some new world, fantastic, dim, uncertain as under sea, traversed by cloudy shapes and beings, a world, a glimmer, or a flower, glimmering and trembling, trembling and unfolding, a breaking light, an opening flower. It spread in endless succession to itself, breaking in full crimson and unfolding and fading to palest rose, leaf by leaf and wave of light by wave of light, flooding all the heavens with its soft flashes, every flash deeper than other. So it is an image of the divine rose of light depicted by Dante in Paradiso, part of his Divine Comedy. Dante uses this rose of light symbol to stand for the beatific vision of God, as Beatrice takes him to have the beatific vision of God. Joyce appropriately uses this image here, which is a climax of all the rose images. Now you remember that throughout this novel, the rose images have been used to mean a stage of psychic progression or psychic development. And the ultimate rose image is the rose of light, which in Dante stands for God, the vision of God. Here it stands for a quasi-spiritual experience by Stephen. That is, he feels in his mind that he has this ecstatic experience of ultimate vision of beauty. And probably he is dreaming, because the paragraph begins, he closed his eyes in the languor of sleep. So he is sleeping and dreaming, and he is dreaming of the rose of light, which is also a metaphor taken from literature. So we have seen that this is also Joyce's stock method in this novel, the recycling of earlier literary images. For example, we have seen he used the image of Madeleine taken from Alexandre Dumas. Sorry, not Madeleine, but Mercedes, the Count of Monte Cristo, and so on. So recycling of images is helpful because these images have associations, allusions, and they expand the present context, the present reference, and transports the reader to earlier allusions and associations. Therefore, this image is a climactic image that makes the reader understand that Stephen arrives at some kind of psychic experience and culmination of psychic experience. The next chapter will be all about Stephen's aesthetic theory mostly. So here, this chapter has the usual pattern of crisis and its resolution. So the crisis was that he was made to choose between a religious profession and the profession of the artist, and this crisis is resolved at the end with the bird girl image and the image of the beatific vision of the rose of light in his dream, which indicates that Stephen will choose the artistic profession over the spiritual profession. Because even though in Dante the rose of light stands for God, here it stands for Stephen's vision of his personal religion of art. Alright. Alright then, so more or less we have explained this chapter. I will stop here. If you have any questions, you can ask.